The scorching sun hung high in the sky, its relentless heat pressing down on the bustling construction site. The air was thick with dust, the rhythmic clanking of metal against stone echoing through the half-built structures. Sweat trickled down Ramesh's forehead as he wiped it away with the back of his rough, calloused hand. His shirt, once a light shade of blue, was now darkened with sweat and dust. His body ached, his muscles sore from hours of lifting heavy bricks, mixing cement, and following orders barked at him by the site supervisor. Ramesh was no stranger to hard work. He had been a laborer for as long as he could remember. Day in and day out, he toiled under the sun, his hands shaping buildings that he could never afford to live in. But despite the exhaustion, he never let go of one thing: hope. A deep-rooted belief that someday, somehow, life would offer him an opportunity. He just had to be ready to take it. Yet, opportunities were rare in his world. Every day was a battle for survival, earning just enough to feed his wife and young daughter. Life had been unkind, but he had learned to endure. He had learned to dream in silence. One afternoon, as he bent down to lift another sack of cement, he overheard two engineers discussing an upcoming project. They need more skilled workers for the new site. Anyone with experience in masonry or carpentry will get better pay, one of them said. Ramesh's ears perked up. Skilled workers? He had watched them for years, observed their techniques, memorized their movements. But could he prove himself? Could he step beyond being just a laborer? The thought lingered in his mind, stirring something within him, an unfamiliar mix of excitement and fear. He wanted to ask, but the words got stuck in his throat. Would they even consider him? What if they laughed at the idea of a mere laborer trying to step up? The next morning, as the supervisor walked by, Ramesh gathered his courage. His heart pounded as he took a step forward. "Sir, I want to learn masonry. I can work extra hours, practice after my shift," he said, his voice steady but laced with nervousness. The supervisor stopped, giving him a long, assessing look. Then, with a smirk, he said, "You? A mason? Do you even know how to hold a trowel properly?" Laughter erupted from the other workers nearby. Ramesh felt his face burn, but he refused to back down. "Give me one chance," he pleaded. The supervisor sighed. "Fine. After your shift, show me what you can do. But don't waste my time." That evening, when everyone else packed up and left, Ramesh stayed behind. His hands trembled as he picked up a trowel, the cool metal foreign yet oddly familiar in his grip. He closed his eyes, recalling every movement he had ever observed, every wall he had seen built. This was his moment, an opportunity standing right in front of him, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. Ramesh took a deep breath, gripping the trowel firmly in his hand. The supervisor stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him with a skeptical expression. The other workers had gone home, the site now eerily quiet except for the occasional rustle of the wind. The unfinished walls around him stood tall, like silent spectators to the moment that could change his life. His hands trembled slightly as he bent down, scooping a handful of wet cement with the trowel. He could feel the weight of expectation, or rather, the lack of it. Nobody believed in him. They saw him as just another laborer, someone destined to carry loads, mix cement, and take orders without question. But Ramesh had spent years watching skilled masons at work. He had studied their movements, noted how they spread the cement evenly, how they placed each brick with precision. He exhaled slowly and began. His hands, though rough and worn from labor, moved carefully, mimicking the skilled workers he had observed so many times. He spread the cement evenly over the base, then placed a brick firmly on top, adjusting it with delicate taps. He repeated the process, his focus unwavering. Minutes turned into an hour. The supervisor, who had been leaning against a wooden post with disinterest, slowly straightened up. His smirk faded. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he examined Ramesh's work. The wall was not perfect, but it was far from what he had expected. "You've never done this before?" the supervisor finally asked, his voice carrying a hint of surprise. Ramesh shook his head, wiping sweat from his brow. No, sir. But I've watched and learned. The supervisor didn't respond immediately. He ran a hand over the bricks, checking their alignment. There were minor mistakes, small gaps between some bricks, a slight unevenness, but the foundation was strong. For a first attempt, it was impressive. You're rough, but you've got potential, the supervisor admitted grudgingly. If you're serious about this, be here an hour early tomorrow. I'll let you practice before your shift. Ramesh's heart leaped. It wasn't a job, not yet, but it was a real chance to prove himself. He nodded eagerly. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. The supervisor grunted, turning away. We'll see. That night, Ramesh walked home with a strange feeling in his chest. It wasn't quite joy, nor was it relief. It was something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of change. His small house, a single-room dwelling with a tin roof, was dimly lit by a flickering bulb. His wife, Meena, was sitting on the floor, sewing a torn shirt, while their 5-year-old daughter Priya played with a set of old wooden blocks in the corner. Meena looked up as Ramesh entered. You're late today, she said, concern in her voice. Ramesh smiled, though exhaustion weighed on his body. He sat down beside her, taking her hands in his. I got a chance, Meena. A chance to learn masonry. She frowned, confused. Masonry? But how? He explained everything, the overheard conversation, his request to the supervisor, and the hour he had spent practicing. Meena listened carefully, her eyes searching his face. When he finished, she let out a slow breath. That's good, Ramesh. But will they really let you in? You know how these things work. They always choose their own people. Ramesh knew she was right. He had seen it happen many times before. Skilled positions were often given to those with connections, not just ability. But he refused to let doubt creep in. I have to try, Meena. If I don't, I'll always be a laborer. I want more for Priya. For us. Meena nodded, squeezing his hand. Then wake up early. Don't be late. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, Ramesh was back at the site. The supervisor, true to his word, handed him a trowel and a bucket of cement. You want to learn? Then work fast and work right, he said gruffly. Ramesh threw himself into the task. He made mistakes. His hands were not yet steady, and his movements lacked the practiced ease of experienced masons. But he kept going. Each time he got something wrong, he corrected it. The supervisor didn't praise him, but he didn't stop him either. That was enough. Days turned into weeks. Ramesh continued his regular labor work during the day and practiced masonry in the early mornings and late evenings. His fingers became more skilled, his movements smoother. The workers who had once laughed at him began to watch with curiosity. Some even offered small tips, showing him tricks to improve his technique. One afternoon, as Ramesh was stacking bricks, the site's main contractor arrived for an inspection. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He walked through the site, checking progress, speaking to the engineers. Then he paused near Ramesh. This the new guy trying to be a mason? He asked the supervisor, his tone indifferent. The supervisor nodded. Yes, sir. Started a few weeks ago. The contractor turned to Ramesh. Show me. Ramesh's throat went dry. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to focus. He picked up a brick, spread the cement, and placed it with careful precision. Then another. And another. He worked with steady hands, ignoring the weight of the contractor's gaze. Finally, he stepped back. Silence stretched between them. The contractor studied his work, then nodded. Not bad. He turned to the supervisor. Give him a proper test. If he passes, put him on the next project as a mason. Ramesh's breath caught in his chest. He could hardly believe what he had just heard. The supervisor, too, looked momentarily surprised but quickly nodded. "Yes, sir." The contractor walked away, leaving Ramesh standing there, stunned. The workers nearby murmured amongst themselves. Some looked impressed, others indifferent. But one thing was clear: Ramesh had taken a step forward. That night, as he sat with Meena and Priya, he told them everything. Meena's eyes shone with pride, and Priya clapped her little hands. "Papa is going to build big houses," she said excitedly. Ramesh laughed, pulling her into his lap. "Not yet, little one. But soon." He was close. Closer than he had ever been. But something told him that this was just the beginning. A bigger challenge was waiting ahead, and he had to be ready. The days that followed felt different. There was a strange energy in the air, an unspoken shift that Ramesh could feel every time he stepped onto the site. Some workers still looked at him as just another laborer, but others had begun to acknowledge him in small ways. A nod, a brief word of advice, a glance that wasn't filled with ridicule. He wasn't just carrying bricks anymore. He was building something of his own, step by step. But change was never easy. As the week went on, Ramesh noticed that not everyone was happy about his progress. There were whispers, quiet conversations that stopped the moment he came close. Some of the older masons, those who had been working there for years, saw him as an outsider. They had spent their lives mastering their craft, working their way up. And here was Ramesh, a simple laborer, trying to step into their world. One evening, as he was washing his hands near the water drum, a man named Juggin approached him. Juggin was one of the senior masons, well respected and known for his skill. He had been at the site for over a decade, and his words carried weight. "You work hard, Ramesh," Juggin said, his tone unreadable. "But do you really think you can become a mason just like that?" Ramesh met his gaze, sensing the challenge in his voice. "I'm trying to learn. If I work hard enough, I can improve." Juggin let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "It's not just about hard work. You need experience. Years of it. Do you know how many men have tried to climb up, only to be pushed back down?" Ramesh clenched his fists. He knew Juggin wasn't just talking about others. He was warning him. "I'm not asking for shortcuts," Ramesh said. "I just want a chance." Juggin stepped closer, his voice lowering. "A chance comes at a price. Some of us have spent years waiting for that next step. And now, suddenly, they're offering it to you?" He scoffed. "You think the contractor really cares about you? He's testing you. And if you fail, they'll throw you aside without a second thought." Ramesh swallowed hard. He knew there was truth in Juggin's words. The contractor had given him a test, but it wasn't a promise. If he messed up, he would go back to carrying bricks, and this opportunity would slip through his fingers like sand. That night, as he walked home, his mind raced. Was he being foolish? Was he setting himself up for failure? Meena noticed his silence as soon as he entered the house. She placed a warm roti on his plate and sat beside him. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. Ramesh hesitated before speaking. "Some of the masons. They don't think I belong." Meena listened, her eyes filled with understanding. "And what do you think?" Ramesh stared at his plate, deep in thought. "I don't know. I just want to give my family a better life. But what if they're right? What if I fail?" Meena reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Ramesh, if you don't try, you'll never know. You've already come this far. If they doubt you, prove them wrong." Her words settled deep in his heart. The fear was still there, but so was his determination. The next morning, the supervisor handed Ramesh a set of instructions. "Your test starts today," he said. "You have 1 week to build a section of the boundary wall on your own. No help. No corrections. If it's not done right, you're out." Ramesh nodded, his pulse quickening. This was it. His moment to prove himself. He started immediately, working with precision. Each brick, each layer of cement, had to be perfect. The other workers watched from a distance, some waiting for him to fail, others silently hoping he would succeed. But as the days passed, problems began to arise. The cement mixture wasn't holding as well as it should. Some of the bricks were misaligned. And worst of all, someone had tampered with his materials. One evening, as he was cleaning up, he noticed that the cement bags he had set aside were ripped open, the powder spilling onto the ground. His tools had been moved, some even missing. His heart sank. Juggins' words echoed in his mind. A chance comes at a price. Someone didn't want him to succeed. Ramesh stood frozen, staring at the spilled cement, his mind racing. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. His tools were scattered, some missing entirely. He clenched his fists, feeling a surge of anger, but he quickly swallowed it down. Getting angry wouldn't fix the problem. He needed to act fast. He only had a few more days to complete the wall, and every second counted. Taking a deep breath, he bent down and salvaged whatever cement he could. The rest was wasted. He would have to find another way to get more without drawing too much attention. His hands moved quickly, brushing dust off his trowel and aligning the remaining bricks. He could feel eyes watching him from a distance, waiting to see if he would break. But he refused to give up. The next morning, he arrived earlier than usual, hoping to get ahead of any more sabotage. But as soon as he stepped onto the site, his stomach twisted. His partially built wall had been damaged. Some bricks were missing, others knocked loose, the cement still wet where someone had tried to ruin his work. His breath came out sharp, his fists tightening at his sides. Whoever was doing this wanted him to fail. And if he didn't figure out a way to stop them, he would. He looked around. The other workers were busy with their own tasks, but he knew some of them had seen what had happened. Juggins stood at a distance, watching him, his expression unreadable. Ramesh wanted to ask him directly, but he knew it wouldn't help. Confronting someone without proof would only make things worse. Instead, he forced himself to stay calm. He picked up his trowel and started again, repairing the damage brick by brick. Every motion was filled with determination. His hands ached, his back screamed in protest, but he ignored it all. He would not give up. Not now. The day passed, the sun scorching his skin, sweat dripping from his brow. But he kept going. By evening, he had made up for most of the lost progress. His hands were raw, his body exhausted, but the wall still stood. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. As he packed up his tools, the supervisor walked over, glancing at his work. "You're behind schedule," he said, his tone neutral. Ramesh wiped his forehead. "Someone is trying to stop me." The supervisor narrowed his eyes. "And?" Ramesh hesitated. He had expected sympathy, maybe even some help. But the supervisor's face remained hard. "You think this is the first time something like this has happened?" The supervisor continued. "Nobody is going to hand you success, Ramesh. If you want this, you fight for it. You finish that wall. No excuses." Ramesh swallowed hard. The words stung, but deep down, he knew they were true. That night, as he sat with Meena, he couldn't hide the exhaustion on his face. She gently placed a hand on his. "You can still finish it," she said softly. "I know," he whispered. "But someone is trying to make sure I don't." Meena looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then don't let them win." The next morning, he arrived before the sun even rose. This time, he wasn't just here to work. He was here to watch. Hiding behind a stack of bricks, he waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Just when he started to think nobody would come, he heard footsteps. Slow. Cautious. His heart pounded as he peered through the gaps between the bricks. And then he saw him. Juggins. The older mason moved carefully, glancing around before stepping up to Ramesh's wall. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a chisel. Ramesh's blood ran cold. Juggin wasn't just knocking bricks loose, he was making sure they wouldn't hold. If Ramesh's wall collapsed after being tested, nobody would ever trust him as a mason again. He had to stop him. But how? Ramesh's breath caught in his throat. His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched Juggin press the chisel against the mortar, wedging it between the bricks with quiet precision. Every movement was calculated, every strike designed to weaken the foundation of his work. A part of Ramesh wanted to rush forward, to grab Juggin's arm and stop him. But something held him back. He needed to know why. Why was Juggin doing this? Was it just jealousy, or was there something more? Juggin worked quickly, his eyes darting around to make sure no one was watching. He had almost finished tampering with the bricks when a sound broke the silence, a distant cough from another worker arriving early. Juggin stiffened, pocketing the chisel before stepping away casually, blending into the shadows of the unfinished site. Ramesh exhaled slowly, stepping out from his hiding place. His mind raced. He couldn't just accuse Juggin without proof. If he did, it would be his word against a seasoned mason's. Nobody would believe a laborer over someone who had been working here for years. But he couldn't stay quiet either. The real problem was time. He had just a few days left to complete the wall, and now he knew for certain that Juggin, or maybe others, wouldn't stop trying to bring him down. He needed to work smarter. Instead of fixing the damage right away, he decided to strengthen the base first. He mixed the cement himself, making sure it was thicker than before. Every brick he laid, he checked twice. If Juggin or anyone else tried to sabotage it again, they would have a much harder time. By midday, he was drenched in sweat, his muscles screaming from exhaustion. But something unexpected happened. A few of the younger workers who had been watching from a distance approached him. They had seen him working, pushing through the difficulties, and for the first time, one of them spoke up. "You're still at it?" one of them asked, a man named Arif. Ramesh wiped his forehead and nodded. "I have to finish it." Arif hesitated before crouching down next to him. "I can help mix the cement," he offered, almost unsure of his own words. Ramesh looked at him, surprised. "Why?" Arif glanced around before answering in a low voice. "Not everyone agrees with what Juggin is doing." Ramesh felt a spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. That evening, after everyone had left, Ramesh lingered behind, pretending to organize his tools. He knew Juggin would come back. He had to, if he wanted to finish what he started. The site was quiet, the air thick with the scent of drying cement. Then, just as expected, footsteps echoed through the empty space. Juggin. But he wasn't alone. Ramesh's stomach twisted as he saw the contractor walking beside him, deep in conversation. The same contractor who had given him this opportunity. Juggin gestured toward the wall, speaking in hushed tones. The contractor frowned, nodding slightly. Then, to Ramesh's shock, the contractor handed Juggin something small, a folded envelope. A payment. Ramesh's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about jealousy. Someone wanted him to fail, and Juggin was being paid to make sure he did. But why? And who was really behind it? He knew one thing for certain. He was running out of time. Ramesh's hands curled into fists as he watched the quiet exchange between Juggin and the contractor. His heart pounded, not just from anger but from the weight of realization. This wasn't just about one man trying to bring him down. It was something bigger. Someone with power didn't want him to succeed. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. He had two choices. He could confront them now, demand answers, accuse them in front of everyone. But that would only backfire. Without proof, they would turn it against him, making him look like the one causing trouble. Or he could stay silent, pretend he hadn't seen anything, and let them win. No, that wasn't an option. The next morning, he arrived at the site before anyone else. His mind was set. He worked faster than ever, his hands moving with precision, every brick placed with extra care. He reinforced the weak spots, strengthening the structure until he was sure no one could sabotage it. His eyes flickered to Juggin a few times during the day, but the older man didn't approach him. By the afternoon, the supervisor came by to inspect the wall. Other workers gathered around, some whispering, others waiting to see if Ramesh had failed. The tension was thick in the air. The supervisor ran his hand along the structure, pressing against it, knocking lightly on the bricks. Then he turned to the contractor, who stood with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. "It's solid," the supervisor finally said. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some looked impressed. Others, including Juggin, remained silent. The contractor's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something he quickly hid. "We'll test it properly tomorrow," he said. "If it holds, Ramesh will get his chance." Ramesh nodded, but his instincts told him it wasn't over. That night, sleep refused to come. Meena noticed his restlessness. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. "I finished the wall," Ramesh said. "But something doesn't feel right." "The contractor, Juggin, they don't want me to pass." Meena was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Then be ready. Whatever happens tomorrow, don't let them take this from you." Her words stayed with him as he arrived at the site the next morning. Workers gathered for the final test. The contractor stood near the supervisor, arms folded, his sharp gaze fixed on Ramesh. Juggin stood nearby, avoiding eye contact. The supervisor instructed the workers to apply pressure on the wall, simulating the stress it would face once the building was complete. Ramesh held his breath. If his work held, he would earn his place. If it crumbled, he would go back to being just another laborer. A few workers pushed against it. The wall didn't budge. The supervisor nodded, motioning for more force. They pushed harder, but it stood firm. A murmur ran through the crowd. It was strong. It was solid. Ramesh felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. Suddenly, the contractor stepped forward. "Enough testing," he said. "Let's see how it holds under real pressure." Before anyone could react, he picked up a heavy metal rod and slammed it against the wall with full force. The sound echoed through the site, dust rising from the impact. Gasps filled the air. Workers exchanged uncertain glances. Ramesh's heart pounded. That wasn't part of the test. The contractor struck again. And again. He was trying to break it. The third blow landed hard, but the wall held. Cracks formed, dust spilled, but it remained standing. The silence that followed was heavy. The supervisor stepped forward, his expression unreadable. He ran his fingers over the cracks, inspecting the structure. Then he straightened, looking at the contractor. "It withstood the test," he said. "It's a strong wall." The workers erupted into murmurs, some nodding in agreement. A few even smiled at Ramesh. The contractor's jaw tightened. He turned to Juggin, his eyes narrowing. There was something unspoken between them, and in that moment, Ramesh knew, Juggin had failed his part of the plan. He hadn't been able to sabotage it enough. Realizing he had no choice but to accept the results, the contractor exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said. "Ramesh, you'll start as a mason next week." The words barely sank in before the workers burst into cheers. Some clapped him on the back, others shook his hand. Arif grinned, giving him a small nod of approval. Juggin said nothing. He simply turned and walked away. As Ramesh stood there, taking in what had just happened, he felt something deeper than just victory. It wasn't just about proving himself. It was about fighting for what he deserved. And he had won. As the cheers settled, Ramesh let out a slow breath, his chest still rising and falling from the rush of the moment. The weight of all the struggles, the sleepless nights, the bruised hands, it had all been worth it. He had proved himself, not just to the contractor or the workers, but to himself. Meena's face flashed in his mind. She had believed in him even when doubt crept into his heart. He couldn't wait to go home and tell her. He imagined the pride in her eyes, the way she would smile and say, "I told you." The workers slowly began to disperse, returning to their tasks, but the energy in the air had shifted. They no longer looked at him as just another laborer. They saw him as something more. Some of them, like Arif, had already started treating him with newfound respect. As Ramesh gathered his tools, he felt a shadow fall over him. He turned to see Jugan standing nearby, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jugan exhaled and muttered, "You should watch your back." There was no malice in his tone, just a quiet warning. Ramesh held his gaze and replied, "I don't need to. I'll just keep moving forward." Jugan studied him for a moment before nodding slightly, then walked away. The contractor was another story. Though he had announced Ramesh's promotion, his expression had been tight with frustration. Ramesh knew the man had lost something today, not just control, but his grip over who got to rise and who didn't. But that wasn't Ramesh's problem anymore. That evening, as he stepped into his small home, Meena was already waiting at the door, as if she had sensed the moment he arrived. One look at his face and she knew. "You did it," she whispered, eyes shining. Ramesh nodded, and before he could say anything, she threw her arms around him. The exhaustion melted away in that moment. This was what he had fought for, not just a title, not just a position, but a future for them both. Later that night, as they sat together, sharing a simple meal, Ramesh reflected on everything that had happened. The struggles, the betrayal, the unexpected allies. It had all been a test, one that he had passed not just with skill but with determination. He knew this was just the beginning. Becoming a mason was one thing, but proving himself in the long run was another. He would have to work harder, be smarter, and stay true to the values that had brought him here. But for now, he allowed himself to enjoy this moment. Across from him, Meena smiled, her eyes filled with hope. And in that quiet evening, as the city outside hummed with life, Ramesh realized that sometimes, the greatest victories weren't about proving others wrong, they were about proving yourself right.